Hey, I'd like to introduce Colin Camerer from Caltech. She's an expert in, understanding how, boundedly rational we are in our, real world strategic behavior. So, welcome, Colin.
Thanks, Greg. I'm glad we could finally do this after a long
Yeah.
time. The first time you emailed me, you're interested in real estate, and now I think
Yeah.
that's solved.
Oh, God.
So,
It was solid economics.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, check off the box. Anyway, okay. Today I'm going to talk about natural limits, what I call natural limits on strategic thinking. And natural is there because this includes some neuroscience, but I won't say too much about that today unless you're really curious. And we don't know that much on the neuroscience side. Okay, so I'm going to assume that some of you probably know a lot about game theory, and if you don't, and all of you know maybe a little, and we'll give a whirlwind tour, and feel free to like speed me up or slow me down. So the reason game theory is so powerful and has taken over a lot of social science, and as well as things like theoretical biology, is that it's very general. So there are players in the games that are called players. They could be genes that reproduce. They could be nation states. These entities called players choose strategies. Those could be very simple things like a coronavirus, is a player that attacks in a particular way, or it could be a super complicated decision tree. When all the players choose strategies, that creates outcomes that the players have values for. And game theory is a body of mathematics that tries to predict what people will do. And there are two prominent, well, there's one huge tool that's used called equilibrium. And this goes back to work by John Nash and a few people who were precursors of Norman and Morgenstern and what have you. And the key idea in equilibrium is that people are optimizing, giving their guesses about what the other player strategies will do, and they guess accurately. That's the hard part. Giving beliefs is no big deal, but guessing accurately means somehow through introspection, learning, communication, the players have come to figure out exactly what the other side will do. And behaviorally, of course, that's not often very realistic. So another branch of behavioral game theory that I have contributed a lot to, and many others, of course, is designed to explain what happens if some people do not guess each other exactly correctly. And we use an approach called cognitive hierarchy. So let me start with a baby example. I better tell you what it is, and I'll show you some data. So this is a game, it's some beauty contest game based on a passage, a metaphor in Keynes, where he says the stock market is a beauty contest in which you're trying to guess not what the most valuable stock is, but what other people will think the most valuable stock is. And other people may be trying to guess what other people think, and that creates these kind of higher order beliefs. So if everyone thinks that GameStop is worth $483 a share, that could be the price. But if the market somehow changed its collective mind and decides it's worth 79 or whatever the price is today, then that could be the price too. Okay, so in the cognitive hierarchy approach, what we do is to say, well, there's some level zero non-strategic players. There's some base that just act impulsively. They choose what's salient, what springs to mind. It could be a lucky number. It could be, what happened last time. It could be something that, they're instructed to do. It could be completely random. They have no idea, and so they just choose at random, like flipping a mental coin. There are level one players that think they're playing level zero players. And so they're going to be a bit more strategic because they're going to react to the zeros. There's level twos who think they're playing ones or zeros, and level threes and so forth. And so this creates a kind of hierarchy from the most unstrategic you can be, which is the level zero, to the most strategic, the highest level players. And we find, I'll see a little empirically, we find empirically that, model with like 3 levels, 0, 1, and 2 usually does pretty well. So, and presumably hidden, a few people have worked on this, but I haven't. There's some hidden kind of mental cost, like working memory or something like that, where it's if you're a level 5, you have to think about what the 4s do, and to do that, you have to think about what the 3s, because that decides what 4s do. Blah blah blah. And at some point, working memory and confusion kicks in, And also, it doesn't make much difference if you're a level 6 or level 5. You're probably going to make the same choice. Okay, so one method that's used following Keynes is a very simple game where you pick a number from 0 to 100. We're going to take the average of all the numbers, including your own, and 2/3 of the average is the winner. So you want to be as close to 2/3 of the average as you can. And this has a nice sort of Keynesian flavor, but the 2/3 creates a twist, which is you want to be below, 1/3 below the average, but not too low. So you want to be a little bit, it's like introducing a product. You want to be ahead of everybody else, but not too far ahead. Okay, and the equilibrium prediction is the only number distribution at which people are predicting accurately what others will do, given that those others are everyone's predicting accurately what everyone will do, is 0. Because if you say, for example, well, I don't know, I think the average level 0 type will pick 50, I'm going to pick 33. And they don't pick 33, then your guess is incorrect. So you're only in equilibrium if they say, oh, we're going to pick 33. Then your 33 guess, which is 2/3 of 50, is wrong. You should pick 22. But again, then somebody is making a guessing mistake, and that iterative process doesn't end until you get to 0. But here's what actually happens if the New York Times, Kevin Quealy, writes a column about this and invites you to enter a guess online. So this is 50,000 people. And I'm very proud to say this is my guess. So at the time that I logged on, this went on for like a couple of days. You can see there's a big spike at 33. Those are level 1s, we call them. There's also a lot of 50s. So those are either level 0s or, they're not motivated or who knows. And then there are a few people choosing very high numbers, which are a mistake. You're not going to win. If your goal is not to win, then that's fine. But if your goal is to win. So there's a big visible spikes because there's so much data here at 50, 33, 22. And then there's kind of a gap. It seems like once people get to 22, their thinking process sort of iterates faster. And then there's some people choosing 1 or 0. So the 0 prediction of game theory, it's about 5% of the choices. Game theory is 95% wrong. My guess was 20. Okay. And so that just reminds you what I talked about. Okay. So this is both an example of where game theory is wrong and also kind of why it's wrong, right? Because this process of iterative reasoning doesn't go on forever. It has these natural hierarchical type of stopping points. Okay. So this is just a reminder of how this thing works. And these are Poisson distributions. So in most of the work we've done, one question that you immediately have to think about is what is the distribution of these level types? And then there are a lot of ongoing questions like, are they traits? Are they associated with general intelligence? Does it matter if you took a game theory course? Blah, blah, blah. So the Poisson distribution is a beautiful, yeah. Oh, yeah, of course, interrupt.
Just to clarify, when you say you have a higher level type, it doesn't seem like those people are more right. It depends on whether the estimate of who everybody else is, that
Correct.
has to be right.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how would you figure that out? Like the distribution of people by types in the population or by task, right?
Oh, okay. So yeah, here's what you do, which is so we assume there's a Poisson distribution of these level types. Poisson is nice because it uses E, like at Caltech, we use E in social science. You get like a special note from the provost. Thank you for being so scientific. And it's single parameter, unlike say Gaussian normal distributions. The tau is the mean and the variance of the Poisson distribution. So if you're trying to prove some theorems, it's handy. Everything is done through the one parameter. And so if you pick a tau value and a specification of what the 0-step choosers do, like in this example, we usually use just random from 0 to 100, but you can plug in any 0-step assumption you want. And then if it's you can do it with stochastic choice, like inverse temperature, but in this case, if it's deterministic, you're going to see a picture like this, right? So the level 1s will choose 33. What the level 2s do depends upon tau, because the level 2s believe that there's level 0s and level 1s, and the relative proportion will depend upon tau if you think about the algebra a little bit. So what you do is you compute these predicted distribution, and then you just fit with maximum likelihood or moments, try to match the moments like the mean and the variance and the skewness. and there's going to be a tau value that predicts best. So for these data, it's probably, I don't think we computed it. There's a lot of level 1s, so the tau is probably around 1.5 or something like that, which is very common. Okay, and so this is just a reminder of some Poisson distributions. This is the actual distribution, again, just parameterized very elegantly by one thing. And if tau is 1.5, the modal number of steps is just one step. That's what we saw in the data. The most common number was 33. There are a lot of level 0s, though, and the red, around 25%. And then the Poisson distribution, because of its mathematical structure, essentially the combinatorics of k factorial, drops off very fast. So we don't think behaviorally you see very many 5 and 6 level players. And as you noted, in this, if you're super high level, you may not win. It's like, you're being, in British, they say you're being too clever by half.
So
okay.
One thing I noticed in that data set is you don't get clean peaks. I mean, you get a few clean peaks, then you have a lot of noise.
Correct.
Who are those
yes,
players?
Correct. Well, those are, I mean, usually when we estimate this, we usually assume that if there's a level 1 choice like 33, there's some variability around that, like just typical stochastic choice function. So somebody, and it could be very strategic. It could be people saying, I know a lot of people pick 33, but I don't want to tie and have to share, the prize with them, so I'm going to pick 32. But wait, maybe I should pick 31. So there could be like micro strategy around these, and some of those are, remember, in the estimation, we're going to usually deliver around 25% level 0. So some of those are people who are choosing a lucky number. They're 40 years old, they choose 40. Their son just turned 21, they pick 21. I think the general theme here, which is prominent in behavioral economics, is the heterogeneity is important. And in this game, for example, if a lot of people are not choosing 0, they're choosing higher numbers. Even if you know the Nash equilibrium is 0, you should choose a higher number too. So the sort of less rational players pull the more rational or the more strategic players in their direction.
And that's one more thing.
That's really
important.
What's up with all
these zeros? It sounds like that's a lot of level 5 players.
Yes. Yeah. Some of those are people who've seen the game before. Some of them are kind of showing off. I mean, these are non-behavioral game theorists. They're almost like Asperger's game theorists in the sense that these are people who may really believe a huge percentage of other people are going to pick 1 and 0, and so that's the right number. Or they're acting like they're answering the wrong question, what Danny Kahneman calls attribute substitution. The question is pick a number so you can win, and the question they're answering is what's the Nash equilibrium. And sometimes those coincide, but it really depends on what other people do.
Right, makes sense.
Yeah. Okay.
Can I actually ask you a humble
question? Yeah. This is a good workhorse example, so it's a good jumping off point for lots of
things. I think many of the people on this call can think faster and in a more sustained way than I can. Mm-hmm. So maybe I think that they're higher level than I am. I'm kind of confused. That doesn't seem to fit into this hierarchy. Like, it seems like everyone has to think that they're the smartest guy in the room. Right?
Yeah. That's right. Yeah, exactly. So we haven't figured out an ideal way to do that. So that let's say you're a normal level 2 player. If you're playing with, just like New York Times readers. But at Google, you think, I know there's some level 3s and 4s here, and I have to anticipate what they do. Our view mostly has been, if a level 2 player analyzes what a level 3 does, then you've become a kind of temporary level 3 yourself. I think more likely what happens is just like if someone's speaking French and you don't understand French, you hear noises, and you may even hear some phrases that are familiar, but it's just extremely noisy. So if you're level 2, you think, I have a feeling people are going to pick some number lower than mine, but I'm not exactly sure, and you make some kind of ad hoc adjustment. But it's true in this kind of we call it in economics toy model. In this version, the idea that you have a kind of humility, like a strategic comparative humility about your level, is not in the model. It's a really interesting question. And there is some evidence that, for example, you could take a bunch of undergrads and you say, you're playing a group of people on Amazon Mechanical Turk, or you're playing graduate students in economics who study game theory, they do change their behavior, which is not something that's explained in this starter model. Okay, let me just mention one more game that's elegant and an example, and I'm going to go through these again very briskly and expect you to stop me if you can articulate a confusion or something that's really tripping you up. This is an actual Swedish lottery that was played a few years ago. This is a little card. So you could go into a store in Sweden, and this card, you have to fill out these numbers on these little boxes, and you can pick a number from 1 up to 99,999. And that limit is just, that's the number of boxes that are on the card. And it has to be an integer. And in this example, for example, you could pick 6 different numbers if you want to. And the game is very simple conceptually. The lowest number that's unique wins 10,000 euros. And then there's some additional prizes. But in the theory, we just focus on the main prize. So this is an interesting game because being low is pretty easy, like pick 1. Being unique is really hard. You have to think about what we call anti-salience, like what is it that no one would think of, knowing that everyone's trying to think of the unique thing. It's like picking an outfit for a fancy ball, right? Right? God forbid you wear the same thing as somebody else, but everyone else is trying to do the same. Okay. And so mathematically, this is just beautiful. Joseph Wong, Eileen Chow worked on this too. It turns out if the number of players is not fixed, it's not 53,000 exactly, but the number of players comes from a Poisson distribution. Sometimes there's more, sometimes there's less. It's just a complete coincidence it's also Poisson here. Then the frequency P of K of the population choosing the number K is a solution to this system of simultaneous equations. And this idea of this, they're called Poisson games. So Poisson game is just a game of any kind in which the number of players is not the same every time. So in auction theory and in political theory, where you study voting, these are used oftentimes. So, it may be a lot of people voting, in which case your votes counts less, or there may be very few, in which it counts more. And it turns out it just has super elegant, gorgeous structure. And Roger Myerson, the Nobel laureate, invented these. And people have done very little. Well, I'm not sure why. I think it's sort of an answer to a very narrow range of questions. But in our case, it's very hard to solve the distribution if the number of players is fixed because of combinatorial problems. It's just a very hard problem in applied math. No one solved it. I think it's probably solvable, but difficult to compute, like computing an optimal chess strategy, And I should add, so given the audience, I have to tell you, every time I've talked to a very computer sophisticated audience about this, like people in CS or maybe applied math, somebody emails me and says, "That's really interesting. I'm gonna solve it for you." But solve it is this loop we call loopy game, lowest unique positive integer. I'm gonna solve it for a fixed number of players. I'll send you an email tomorrow. No email. So it's, as I guess some of you would say, it's non-trivial. But if the number of players is not this fixed, but has this distribution itself, then it can be computed and solved anyway. And oh, should I left out the data? Oh, okay. Oh, I can't believe it. Anyway, so what turns out what happens is a lot of people pick 1, and a lot of people pick 2, and by a lot I mean way more than are predicted in this Poisson-Nash equilibrium. So the Poisson-Nash equilibrium is a wild property. It's basically a super flat distribution. So the most frequent number, P of 1, is the highest value. P of 2 is a little bit lower, P of 3. So it does make sense. The thing that should be picked most often is 1. but not that much more than 2, not much more than 3. It's super, super flat. It just goes down very, very slowly. And then there's a sharp drop off at 5,513, which is just some magic number that comes out of solving this math. And in the data, way too many people pick low numbers. And there's a gap where very few people pick 2,500 up to 5,000. And if you do, you're going to win. You're going to basically beat the lottery. But over 49 days that it was played, you can see the distribution filling in. So by the 49th day, they're actually extremely close to the Poisson-Nash equilibrium, because you can literally watch on TV the lottery outcomes, and people adjust. So if you picked 142 and you thought you were so clever because it's a low number, a bunch of other people probably did too, out of the 55,000. And you find out on the news that the winning number was 3,000, so you move toward 3,000. And the whole system, it just adjusts like in a kind of belief learning. There's a number of learning dynamics that are going to move the entire system. Let me just talk you through this one quickly, and then I'll basically kind of stop or have questions. So this is 2 movies that came out a few years ago. The Metacritic is an aggregation of critics. Metacritic that goes from 0 to 100. Metacritic for Killers was 21, and Metacritic for this Neil Jordan directed movie Ondine, lookup number, I think it was 75 or something like that. And notice that in the ad for Ondine, there's actually blurbs with stars: an enchanting love story, a charmer. For Killers, there's no blurbs. The reason is Killers was opened cold, which is a industry term for not sending it out to critics to watch in time to write their reviews for the Friday newspapers. Now, this is all ancient economic history, right? Because Friday newspaper reviews no longer play such a prominent role. But back in the day, this is 2000 to 2016, I think is our data. The Friday reviews were a big deal. So this raises an interesting strategic question, which is, if you see this Killers ad, and you notice, you probably don't actually, because that's part of the strategic naivete, and also people are more likely to notice things that are present rather than to notice things that are absent, like the Sherlock Holmes, the dog didn't bark, and that's actually key evidence, right? But people tend to notice presence, not absence. Our visual system just works that way. But if you were sophisticated, you would say, wait a minute, there's no reviews. They probably didn't send this out for review. What kind of movies would they send out to review? And now I have to do some Bayesian reasoning. If it was good, they would send it out. If it was bad, they might not send it out and try to trick people into thinking, well, that doesn't really mean anything. Maybe they just were busy or they were late. And so if you this is hundreds of movies. There's, again, it looks pretty Gaussian because it's aggregating 3 critics, and the critics don't always agree. So the central limit theorem comes in, and there's only a few that are 80 to 100. Those are, big, super popular art house movies like Parasite, stuff like that. And The Departed, I think, was in here. There's a bunch of 60. Most movies are 40 to 60. And then there's a few that are really low, like the 21 for the Killers. And so the red is the number of movies that were not shown to critics for a Friday review. And indeed, there's what's called an unraveling property, which is if you have a movie that's 40 and above, show it to critics. Because if you don't, sophisticated moviegoers might think, God, it's probably really terrible. And your movie is above average. Of the 20 to 40s, more of those are not shown to critics. There's more red, but there's still a lot shown to critics. But if you have a 0 to 20, half of them are not shown to critics. And at that point, you think, well, maybe people will infer. So the sophisticated moviegoers know. The sophisticated moviegoers act like they know what the red and blue charts are, and they can do some math. So if you don't see a review, you think, well, it's either 0 to 20 or 20 to 40. And so my conditional expectation, conditional on no review, is that it's a 20. But the naive moviegoers think, oh, okay, no reviews, it's probably right in the middle, like most movies. So even though your movie is actually a 20, a bunch of people are going to think it's a 50 and go to the movies. And what happens is on IMDb, you then get moviegoer ratings that are really low. And people say, I thought it was going to be, I don't know why it was so bad. I was really surprised. I thought it was going to be okay. And that's the human language's way of saying, I didn't take into account the fact that there was no reviews. Okay. And the rest is just that if you run a regression, you can see that here. So this is Metacritic rating on the x-axis. The residual is a regression of the box office, leaving out the Metacritic rating and putting everything else in. And if you look at the cold opening movies, which are the reds, versus the regular movies that are shown to critics, which is blues, the cold opening movies are a little bit higher. There's a positive residual. It's about 15%. So they get about 15% more than they would if all the moviegoers were strategically sophisticated and realized that no reviews on killers means bad. That they knew what the red and blue distribution was. So that's evidence for a little bit of essentially profiting from this kind of strategic naivete. Okay, final thought, just to echo something I said before. So in economics, there's something called complements and substitutes. Strategic complements means if people are choosing like a high number, I want to choose a high number. Strategic substitutes means if everyone's picking the number one, I want to pick a different number. And Ernst Fahrenheit in Science wrote a short paper saying the answer, well, a narrow answer to the very broad question of when does highly rational behavior dominate markets or groups or company decisions. One helpful answer is if there's strategic complements, like if you know there's zeros in Nash equilibrium, but you think that most people are level one, you should move away from Nash equilibrium toward those less rational people. The highly rational people have to move to the less rational. So that's like, if you think a bunch of people on Reddit, Wall Street Bets, are way overpaying for GameStop at 200, but you think it's going to go up, you could buy GameStop, even though you know the true value is $5. But if you think it's going to go from 200 to 500, you could be purchasing. So the irrationals can kind of like make the market behave irrationally en masse, and strategic substitutes is the opposite. So in that case, if a few people are irrational, this is the kind of, I went to the University of Chicago for PhD. The Chicago view is if there's a lot of irrational people, smarter people and smarter organizations will spring up to take advantage of them and take their money or teach them not to be irrational, and the rationality will drive irrationality out of the markets. And in a lot of markets, I think that's probably correct. And a lot of other things like group decision making. But for things like the stock market, it just doesn't look that way. And for things like the 2/3 of the average contest. I'm going to talk about macro a little bit, which Greg mentioned. But the things we're continuing to work on is what exactly do these strategic level zeros do? I think the answer is salience, and we need to go back to attentional psychology. Some of you may know Kevin Leighton Brown, a computer scientist at UBC. He's done some nice work on this with James Wright. Skill is something we're really fascinated by because in Nash equilibrium, everyone has the same amount of skill. Nobody is predicting more accurately than anybody else. That's the definition. So if you said, hey, I'm interested in skill in strategizing, the last thing you want to do is study Nash equilibrium. There's no skill there. There just is no concept. In these cognitive hierarchy models is a very natural way to think about skill, which is higher levels. And we have done some application with private information games, like the movie disclosure, where one person actually knows more. And even though you don't know what that person knows, you have maybe a prior belief on what they know. That's what's called a common prior assumption. And so then poker is a super interesting game. We started to study with EEG brain scanning, but we got interrupted by COVID and it was very hard. But poker is a great model for a lot of things because it has emotional regulation in it. It has level K strategic thinking. It's easy to recruit subjects to be in an experiment. And there's a bunch of books that are just full of behavioral insights. Poker as kind of a game, other than a toy model like 2/3 of the average, which leaves so much out. poker puts a lot in. And again, I can say a little bit about macro or anything else you're interested in. I was trying to aim to end at 9:30, which I almost did.
So maybe you want to finish the macro slide, and then we can open up for questions.
Okay, yeah, there's one macro slide. Greg and I've emailed a little bit about an approach I think is absolutely fascinating. If I was in macro, this is what I would do, but I'm not. One thing you would think economists might do a lot of, but they do not, is agent-based modeling of emergent behaviors. I connected to Santa Fe Institute, but you may have a much more nuanced geography of where the hotspots are for doing this type of research. And the beauty of agent-based modeling is you can have that agent do almost anything you want in almost any artificial environment and just simulate and discover some stuff, which is how agent-based modeling is used in some other things like studying how emergence of trade, and you can sort of rewrite history, like how do institutions emerge, like how do you model religion? There's so many beautiful things you can do. It's extremely unpopular in academic macroeconomics. And unfortunately, to make things a little worse, academic macroeconomics, by which I'll include the Federal Reserve System, which employs a huge number of PhDs, and the policy apparatus like the Fed, all of those are essentially, there's a kind of revolving door of academics like Janet Yellen and Ben Bernanke, who come from academic macroeconomics. And the academic macroeconomics uses essentially one formula, which is a lot of models use what's called a representative agent, which means there's a single agent cloned times 320 million Americans. And that way you can boil down, you just figure out what does that agent do and then multiply by 320 million. That, so you go from micro, the one agent, to macro is multiplying by 320 million. And they really like the idea of solving a model analytically in the closed form versus simulating more realistic agents. And so agent-based modeling has gotten very little traction. If you go to Stanford, has a strong macro group, or you go to Chicago or Princeton or anywhere, and you will basically be taught in the first year sequence that this is garbage because you can't prove things with simulations, and that nothing interesting has come out of agent-based modeling. And then you're like kicked out of the priesthood if you decide you want to do this, which I think is very unfortunate. And so that's just a statement of why. I would tell you all about what's been discovered, but very few people have been working on this. Okay, that's the end of slides.
Questions for anybody?
I have a question about measuring skill. You talked about that with poker. A few years ago, I read Annie Duke's book. Annie Duke is a professional poker player, and she talked about how one of the premises of her book, is like, sometimes when people do well, they overly attribute to skill what should be attributed to luck. And sometimes even if people do poorly, it was still a correct decision to make, even if it just didn't pan out correctly, just based on the odds, based on luck. What are there other books or other resources where people can learn more about how to assess like skill for players, or thinking about that, of like the distribution of skill among people in the game?
Actually, I got to know Annie Duke a little bit. She's quite remarkable. Since you brought it, let me mention one thing, which is she actually started a PhD in psychology at Penn, and I was at Penn, I think a little bit before her, at University of Pennsylvania, and then she got sick, and various things happened, and she started to play poker, I think, while she was in the hospital.
Yeah,
and
she
then
moved to Montana and started playing poker or something. It was something.
Yeah, right, exactly. I'm sure she tells the story better. And so $27 million later, but she actually just published a paper. So now she's actually back in Philadelphia and is interested in research. So I'm waiting to rope her into some poker project, but I want to wait for the ask, wait for like the perfect thing that I know she won't be able to resist. So she talks a lot about this thing called resulting or outcome bias, which is you made a bad decision, but it turned out well, and people take that as a positive sign. And the other way around is you made the right decision and it turned out badly. And so one question is what's real skill, and then the other is what drives these kind of perceptions of skill. And a fair amount of that is known from psychology about what we call these attribution errors. Like, do you mistakenly attribute luck to your own skill, rather a lucky outcome to your own skill? I think she has a recent book. There's also a book by Maria Konnikova about who is a New Yorker writer. I think it's called Bluffing or something like that. And that's a great book because she's also semi-academic and spent a lot of time with some talking to people about aspects of poker. And she actually ends up, she says, I'm going to take a year and try to become a professional poker player. And she gets a guy to be like her sensei coach. And he's very interesting too, because they're all trying to explain like what's the recipe for poker by explaining it in the English language plus a lot of poker jargon. A lot of the skill they talk about she talks about in her book has to do with emotion regulation, I would say, which is to avoid, they call it going on tilt, which is basically when you're losing, making really wild bets to try to catch up. And another phenomenon in poker that's very interesting is they say, play the person, not the cards. So if you're playing like a long 10-hour, like she's playing in these tournaments, 2 or 3 days, 12 hours in a row. It's, you're eating like power bars and so on. And she also talks about training and getting enough sleep and being physically fit, because it's mentally very draining, like really draining. The same with chess at the highest levels. And so one of the things Maria Konnikova and Annie are doing when they're sitting at the poker table is, for 10 hours, is they're building up like a personalized, almost like a therapist, like a mental model of each other player. And Maria talks about in her book, especially Annie maybe too, being a woman is very unusual at the high level. And so I think what goes on is when men, it's some very old evolutionary caveman thing. When the male poker players, especially the weaker ones, I think the ones who are really self-confident, they don't care what your gender is. They're sort of like race blind, gender blind, age blind. But the ones who are more insecure will bet very aggressively to try to knock the woman out of the game. And we also have some data from Jeopardy where we saw this, where people bet more in Jeopardy if there's a woman opponent. I
did my undergrad. Anyway. Yeah, I did my undergrad at MIT, and this makes me think a lot about. While I was there, I got to take some of the courses at Sloan, like MIT's MBA.
Right. Oh yeah,
school. And I took a negotiation course, and I often found that where I think people, because I was like, an undergraduate woman there, among a bunch of like MBAs, that people I think often assumed I was a weaker player. So sometimes I would do excellent in negotiations, and I think it's a similar phenomena. So I've always found that really fascinating, of how do you assess skill and thinking about distribution of skill in games. So thank you.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. In fact, I taught negotiations at Penn and at University of Chicago for a while, and you saw it every time. And now, if I was back doing that, I would have like a whole module, and I think some of the modern courses talk about. We used to talk a lot about cross-cultural, issues and negotiations. Like Americans are notorious for wanting to kind of get to the deal very quickly, whereas in the Middle East and in Asia, it's like you're building a relationship first, and then the deal talk comes at the very end. But the men were always very blustery. And they thought negotiation was like arm wrestling, and like women have weak arms, and sometimes it is probably, but usually not. And usually it's about listening, right? And like knowing when to stick to your guns, creating opportunity, from the course, right? There's some basic general lessons. So I think that is similar to poker. But the Maria Konnikova point was that she was like, I could weaponize my femininity. And she has long hair and, is pretty. I can weaponize my femininity because they think I'm this dumb girl who probably has some rich guy giving her money. And she has a few episodes where it's really upsetting to her because somebody plays very aggressively and makes comments, and often they trash talk at the poker table. That's part of what poker is interesting too, is, right, does the trash talk work, and when do you do it? And other people are just quiet as a mouse. Anyway, so back to your question about skill, I think the skill of these very outstanding poker players has a lot of dimensions to it. It has this, model building of your opponent. Sometimes, I wish I had read it recently. I forget all the poker jargon, but sometimes you stay in the hand even though you think you'll lose, just because then you'll get to see the other person's cards. And then you can tell if they're playing tight, which means they only bet heavily when they have good cards, or if they're bluffing a lot, which means they'll bet heavily, but then you see they had bad cards. And the only way you can see their cards is to play out to the end, because if one person ends up winning, they don't have to show their cards.
Yeah, like you're willing to pay this price to get the information.
Exactly. Exactly. And it can also look like you're being stupid, right? Because if you're going to show your bad cards and they think, oh man, Kate doesn't know what she's doing, so you get the information value. You're buying information the only way you can. And again, that's another thing that people don't like to lose normally, right? But the emotional regulation is, if you feel like you're losing kind of on purpose and you're learning something, you realize that the information value in model building is really good.
Awesome.
So
Thank
to
you
what
so much.
extent? I mean, this is really cool. I'm trying to see, like, if I'm trying to model the stock market. So, GameStop, people expecting stuff about others. Real estate market, way stickier, but people expecting where other people want to live. Or I'm thinking, local example, YouTube. You have content providers, consumers, and advertisers. Three parties that are adjusting around each other. Like, how would you apply these models, to predicting their behavior?
So I'll give a quick answer. So there are a few papers in macroeconomic theory of the academic type that I was talking about, and this came very late. We've been working on these general concepts of non-equilibrium game theory or hierarchy game theory since like the early 1990s, and especially after 2004. Building up, experiment after experiment, and looking at this stock market data. Looking at the movie critics data, and the macro papers are quite recent. So what they've been looking at is higher order expectations of inflation. So in academic macro, basically it's all about unemployment and inflation, and those are related in some extremely simple kind of formulaic way. So they're trying to boil this very complicated system down to a few, the critical, like, moving parts. And there, the way they use this is to say the level zeros is this year, and the level ones think that level zeros have those expectations. But if they have those expectations, then that will affect the economy in a certain way that falsifies the expectations. So if you think inflation will be the same as it was last year, that will cause the economy to have a different inflation. And if you're a level one player, you forecast that different inflation correctly. And then the level twos forecast level ones, and so on. And there's a little bit of retrofitting, but it's basically the same type of model. And one small payoff to that, and again, we're at the upper limits of my macro knowledge. It actually just came because I was at Columbia giving this lecture, a long version of this lecture, and contracted to write a short book based on the lecture series, and was talking to Mike Woodford, who's worked on this topic, and he was kind of tutoring me. And there's something called the forward guidance puzzle, which basically means if the Fed says we're going to keep interest rates low for the next 2 years, or the Fed says we don't want to overheat the economy, we're going to raise interest rates 2 years from now. That in standard macro models with what's called rational expectations, which is essentially high level strategic thinking, so that everybody, and it depends on the credibility of the Fed too, right? Like if Janet Yellen says it, if she's credible, people believe it. It could be somebody else who's not credible. So there's a hidden variable called credibility, which we don't know too much about, right? It's like charisma or something. But if suppose Janet Yellen's credible and she says we're going to raise interest rates in 2 years, that's called forward guidance, and that should have an effect right away. Because the future expectations are being used to influence current behavior, like companies will start to hire or something like that. And when you look empirically at studies, forward guidance has very little effect. And it seems like the answer to why that is has to do with these level Ks. Because what Mike Woodford showed in these are very complicated papers mathematically, and they're very specialized type of math. And another guy called Ivan Verning at MIT actually was that if you put in these levels of reasoning about inflation expectations, right, that you can explain why you would get a very muted reaction to forward guidance. There's going to be a little bit of an effect, but not very much, because the level zeros and the level ones essentially don't take it seriously. They just don't plan and think about the future accurately. So that's one kind of example about the macroeconomy.
One thing you mentioned is everybody's the same in the macroeconomic model, but in the Agentbased model, right, everybody's different. And I understand why the macro people, worry about Agentbased because there's just too many parameters. So,
yes, yeah,
but
exactly.
what I'm also hearing right now is, what if I had like one agent per level? Would that be good enough to have those types of agents interact? Or is that an appropriate way of incorporating this model into traditional macro?
Yes. I think, to be honest, you can make a lot of progress with two levels, where one is where the levels are almost like caricatures, you know what I mean? So the least sophisticated agent is really pretty dumb. Like in stock market models, there's often a trend chasing, momentum traders, right? It's like it went up, it's going to go up again. And then you have sophisticated traders who think that they're trading with a mixture of these dumb money momentum traders, and they may also have a kind of self-awareness, which is not in the model I've talked about, but you can kind of build it in, where the sophisticated traders know there are other sophisticated traders like themselves. So they all hang out. They all live in Connecticut and hang out at hedge funds, or they go back and forth to different firms. So they all went to Caltech and MIT for undergrad and stuff like that. So 2 levels is often will get you a pretty long way, because the interplay of and it goes back to the paper with Ernst Fair that I mentioned, which sometimes these very sophisticated traders have to sort of accommodate or follow or influence the less sophisticated ones, right? Like choosing numbers. And other times they're going to eat them. Again, I don't know much macro to think about that. So for example, I think usually either explicitly or implicitly, when in empirical macro, when people look at like expectations data, I think the presumption is that sort of corporations, for example, have better forecasts of future inflation than households. So the households are treated as kind of dumb and backward looking. And there's also some interesting data. The average person's concept of inflation and perceptions of inflation is not very sophisticated. Even though you can Google, you can Google, current inflation rate, and in 10 seconds you know what the official inflation rate is. And as you may know too, and measuring inflation is actually not that easy too, because it's hard to adjust for. It's easy to measure prices, but it's hard to adjust for quality. And so, actually, what the inflation rate is not. Anyone who's dug into it is not as simple as one might hope. And that's even in developed markets. And then you go to somewhere like Mali, and if there's an informal black market and a lot of what people buy isn't really priced, then who knows what the inflation rate is. Anyway, so for example, households are influenced by things like gas prices, and it's true that energy is a substantial chunk of the typical household consumption purchasing. If gas prices double in a month, people feel like, oh my God, there's high inflation. right? So they aren't necessarily implicitly putting the right weight on things that they see every day. And I think it's the same true with consumer products. Like if there's if there's some macro shock to the coffee market, and suddenly Starbucks raises prices by 25 cents, and you go to Starbucks every single day, that may enter into the household, the unsophisticated household perception of inflation. And then the macro model should say, okay, suppose households misperceive inflation, or inflation changes in some systematic way that we can easily build in an agent-based model. Then how is that tail going to wag the dog of the entire macroeconomy?
Makes sense. Cool. Does anybody else have any questions? Okay, so then let me ask one more question in the time. One that occurred to me was there's some seem to be like obvious failures of like classical economics or sociology that say like persistence of racism. Usually the story is people who are rational are gonna like hire people from on the edge of a privileged group, make better money and dominate. But usually they don't, because there are people get benefits from hiring their in-group or buying from their in-group and so on. So that seems like that should be you model that by saying there's multi-objective targets that I benefit from in-group stuff, you don't. So how does that, having different agents benefit from different payment types, fit into this decision making?
Some of that is pretty easy. It is basically in foundational economics. So the foundation of trade is different endowments. Well, in kind of economic 101 language, it's different endowments and different tastes, right? So our neighbor has a grapefruit tree. We have roses. We're like, it's called the Robinson Crusoe economy. And so she brings over these giant bags of these humongous grapefruits, like small basketballs, and we give her some roses. And that basic idea that people may want different things, and people may be differentially productive at different things, is the basis for economics 101. So that's not too difficult. What's more difficult and still consumes a lot of professional attention is what exactly those differences in tastes are, and are there really like tastes? Like I love grapefruit and my wife does, and our neighbor loves roses. We love roses too, but we have so many that we're happy to share. Racism is a kind of a good case, because the predominant view in economics, which is I think complete, is it's either tastes, like I'm a white owner and I don't like black people, so I'm not going to hire Colin F to play quarterback for me. That's like your example, right? They're just trading off the desire to win football games and the distaste for having black players. Let's say this is just a cartoon example. I don't know if that's the case, and what have you. Just a toy example. The other idea, which is more interesting, is what's called statistical discrimination, which means I think most black people aren't good at football, and I can't get the information about whether Colin Kaepernick is in this general group of incompetent players actually stands out and is really good. So now there's two questions about taste-based discrimination. One is, why does it persist? Like, can't you just find out? Like, you have exactly what they do in football. You have auditions. You have the NFL Combine. So why does it persist? And number two, is it really statistically correct? Right. So, for example, I hope this doesn't touch too close to home, but you may have a stereotypical perception that say girls can't code, right? And that may be correct, right? And then the question is, how do the entire distribution of girls and boys, say, is not overlapping, right? There's some difference in ability or propensity, or it came that way because the girls wanted to learn to code in second grade or fourth grade using Scratch, but they were discouraged by a teacher, right? So it's a very complicated combination of actual differences in skill and socialization and what have you. But what should occur is finding new institutions and tests and information to figure out, say, again, this is a just stylized, hokey example, which girls can code. I think the current view is that these kind of incorrect statistical discrimination can persist for a surprisingly long period of time. By surprisingly long, I mean decades, or in some cases, in the old days, like centuries. So I'll give you one final closing example. I think is very, since we got on this topic about racism. So Gary Becker, the famous economist at Chicago, really a monumental influence on everybody, including me, pointed out, suppose you have either taste-based discrimination against, say, black quarterbacks, or black quarterbacks in the NFL, taste-based, we just don't want to hire them, or it's statistical discrimination. We haven't seen enough successful black quarterbacks to break our hunch that they're not very good at quarterbacking. Then what you should see is that the occasional black quarterback who does get hired got hired because they had to be that much better than the other white quarterbacks. And so the black quarterbacks that do make it will be better on average. So if there's a discriminated against group and some of them happen to break through, whether it's taste or statistical, doesn't matter, then the ones who succeed must be better. So you could see this in like female CEOs. If you look at female CEOs and male CEOs, if there's discrimination, one test for discrimination is that the females should be better than the males, because the females only got to be picked if they were that much better. They had to be unusually good to get picked. And it turns out when I was at Penn, Janice Eberly worked on this, and unfortunately for black quarterbacks, there was so few data, it was hard. You couldn't get like a statistical significance, but the early black quarterbacks were actually better than the white quarterbacks, which is consistent with this story. But again, there were so few that it was like 6 versus 191. And I think the same is true with NFL black coaches. If you watch the Super Bowl, the Buccaneers coach, the head coach is white. I think he's a great coach as far as I know him. But of the entire coaching staff, every other single assistant coach, they have these offense coordinator, the kicking coach, what have you. There's one woman, and the rest are black males. Why aren't those black males head coaches? And I think some of them will be eventually. But the final thing about that, for those of you who know football, Dan Rooney, who is the son of Art Rooney, who owned the Pittsburgh Steelers, I think around 1990, maybe earlier, instituted a Rooney Rule, which was that if you're interviewing for a head coach, you had to interview at least one black candidate. And that seemed to the poor black coaches in the NFL than there are currently. It would be hard to show that statistically in a rock solid way. But the Rooney Rule was the remedy. So the Rooney Rule is the remedy to statistical discrimination, which is to say you have to at least get more information on the discriminated against group. That probably will lead to some more black coaches, and then the world will have more evidence. Over a 10-year period, you'll see 4 or 5 more black coaches in the Super Bowl, and somebody who is looking at all the data with an objective eye and really just wanted to know statistically who's good at this would get the better answer. And so that was an example, but it was a long time coming, right? I mean, it came in after the NFL was after 20 Super Bowls or something like that, right? So it was a long time coming, and then I think it's had the consensus has had a quite positive effect on improving coaching quality in general.
Well, thank you very much. It was fascinating.